Not again.
How? Again?
Again.
Once again.
Hello and welcome to the Exploding Appendix podcast. Today we are talking to Zara Richter. This session was recorded on the 23rd of March 2021 as part of the Avant-Garde Art Practice and Research Group's free weekly meetup. We have more on our website explodingappendix.com, and you can join our meetups in Brighton or online on Zoom, and find us on SoundCloud, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, Facebook and Eventbrite. Now the interview.
Zara is part of a really fascinating podcast called Facing Autonomy. It's really, really worth checking out in itself. I think there's some really, really fascinating, specifically for this, actually listening through all of them. And they're all really, really fascinating topics. And they all generally are around issues of autonomism, but also just going some more focusing, say, on someone like C.L.R. James, some focusing much more on anarchism and Marxism, and then some that maybe look at something more related around race or gender or something like that. So I do recommend them.
This has been a pet project of mine that I've mainly worked on since the pandemic has began. I think that as this discussion continues, you'll hear more about this project, and in a moment you'll hear more about who I am. And I might give you a brief tidbit about some of my co-collaborators. My main co-host cannot make it today, of course. His name is C.L.R. Ali. He's a graduate student in geography at Ohio University. He's a brilliant thinker who has had a past where he was working in Pakistan as a journalist. He's the main co-contributor to my podcast, and then there's a couple of others who I've kind of located in my Facebook communities that I participate in, who have kind of joined on later on. Yeah. Beside Arturo being the second co-host that we had, who was more of an organic intellectual who is based in Philadelphia.
Yeah, it was a shame we couldn't get Cher on today, really. So yeah, well, one of the things I really like about Facing Autonomy is that you each have sort of very different sort of backgrounds, very different sort of stories and trajectories that sort of inform your activism and thinking.
I am also a philosopher of some type. I'm a PhD student at George Washington University, and I kind of began my studies as something of a devoted partisan in favor of disability rights. You know, I got a master's degree in disability studies at the University of Illinois, Chicago, and I was very much a big campaigner for disability rights. And at that point, I was, I had some mix-ups in the Occupy movement or the anti-war movement here in the States. But, I wasn't quite a revolutionary at that point. And I had a series of experiences within the disability rights community where I witnessed these nonprofits that were not really treating the people that they were supposed to represent very well. They were using them for, what the nonprofit industrial complex does, which is, it creates a corporation out of charity very often, here in the States, so I witnessed them kind of misusing the people their politics were based on. And I have moved toward a further left-wing mix of, say, council communism and anarchism. And as that's happened, I've also I was previously more of a social scientist. I was in a communication studies PhD program. And after my master's, and I kind of got removed from that PhD program for being a bit disagreeable. And then I had to work as a part-time tutor for a year. And then I got offered this PhD doctoral fellowship over at George Washington University with people who are disability scholars, primarily not Marxists and not anarchists. And so this project of Facing Autonomy has been very distinct from the way that I earn my living, which is as a humanities scholar in a place where I'm not able to really express most of my leftist views. And certainly my dissertation, which I'm working on, besides the Facing Autonomy project, is not full of my far left views to such a great extent. And a lot of it is focused on my object of study. It is not full of my left-wing kind of points of view. So, I've had a move from a more liberal politics into an interest in, say, anarchism and council communism over the past, say, 5 years, moving on from my master's in disability studies to these other stints in various parts of education, labor, and education work. My understanding is that Sheer has moved from being a journalist in Pakistan to got a geography master's degree and is doing a geography PhD as we speak currently. So we've had these kind of trajectories that have taken us away from various particularities into a more general area of concern, which encompasses our particular location, but it isn't entirely comprised by these kind of liberal particularisms, which you would get in a disability rights or an LGBT rights or a location or conversation.
Facing Autonomy takes its name in part from the book Facing Reality by the sort of Johnson Forrest tendency associated with the likes of C.L.R. James, and also autonomist movements such as operaismo. So the book Facing Reality sort of spends quite a bit of time discussing the creation of workers' papers and publications, and whilst operaismo had sort of pirate radio. So to what extent do you see your own project as being sort of continuous with, or a development upon, sort of history of workers' media?
I don't feel like the podcast is workers' media quite so much, because I feel like it's closer to being public intellectualism, or kind of a side project taken on by some rather disgruntled former social scientists who have a bunch of left-wing ideas which they have no other kind of outlet for, and so I see it as an extension of intellectualism, either organic intellectualism, because one of our hosts doesn't have any higher education experience, or it's just public intellectualism. I don't see it entirely as just journalistic. Of course, Scheer has some experience as a journalist, but I haven't felt that his experience as a journalist has overtaken the project much. It's been mainly not very different from a social media blog. And you see a lot of social media. I've been involved in a series of social media groups on Facebook devoted to various causes. I was involved in Aftermath, which was a far left-wing Facebook group. I was involved in Facebook groups full of people who follow Amadeo Bordiga for a while on Facebook. I see this venture as similar to all these left book groups, or left-wing Twitter accounts, or Tumblr accounts with left-wing politics. A lot of these have proliferated during the social media era, because workers who have the ability to create content on the internet are kind of disgruntled from the positions they're locked in. They're disgruntled about what the left has become. They're disgruntled about what supposed democracy in various nations and states has become. And so they end up going to these social media platforms, which are designed for interpersonal socializing, and they try to express leftist views or organize leftist views. And of course, it's always a kind of messy attempt, not dissimilar from the attempt that Bradley has put in creating this thing we're on right now.
Mm-hmm. So Marxists such as Sylvia Pankhurst, Rosa Luxemburg, Anton Pannekoek, and C.L.R. James, and Marx himself, for example, in the Civil War in France, have sort of challenged hierarchical and sort of statist models of organization, whilst anarchists like Carlo Cafiero, Enrico Malatesta, Peter Kropotkin, Emma Goldman have explored ideas of anarcho-communism. Given this sort of apparent overlap, what do you see as the sort of difference between Marxism and anarchism?
I feel that if we take a project like a lot of the traditional Marxist projects that began with the Soviet Union, at their basis, there is influence from perspective that really focuses on locally run workers' councils. And I think that in Marxism, this notion of workers' council ends up sounding more like a municipal government. But I think that if you look to the anarchist tradition, you get something very similar to worker councils as well, but they sound more like trade unions. So I think that many of the different languages used by Marxists and anarchists, these two different languages, they kind of break down once it becomes about action. Once you're actually organizing groups of people, the difference between a worker council or a labor union, it becomes almost negligible to me. And so for me, I was initially very interested in anarchism, and then I went through a period of following and reading a lot of Bordiga and left communist kind of thought. And after that, I came back sort of toward a more anarchist approach once more. And I found that there wasn't much difference between, anarcho-syndicalists of Spain and, the council communist movement, which had followers across the world, such as those in parts of Germany, parts of Scandinavia, as well as Iran. So I think that once you get deep enough within parts of Marxism and parts of anarchism, the differences between a trade union and a worker council, or a Soviet in Soviet Russia, those differences are really quite minuscule once practice happens. And so that has taken me far away from choosing a side between the debate between Marxism and anarchism. And instead, I found myself a comfortable something of a mix between council communism and anarcho-syndicalism. And that a lot of that mixture today is described by a lot of people as something called a communizer, which is taken from the work of Giles Daub, who was, again, another follower of Bordiga who kind of went astray and kind of became more anarchistic. Giles Daub is a theorist of communization in much of his work. And I found myself quite influenced by him as far as trying to bring together the more party-based aspects of Marxism with the more trade union-based aspects of anarchism. Other kind of followers of Bordiga that went astray from the Bordigist model are also good examples. there's another one whose name is now eluding me. Kamat, yes, Jacques Kamat is another follower of Bourdieu who kind of went further toward anarchism and started to combine the Marxist things that he had learned from Bourdieu with anarchist kind of ideas, while Kamat is more green anarchist or anarcho-primitivist version of Bourdieu, whereas you get a more anarchist-communist version of Bourdieuism coming out of Dobbs' communization mini tendency, which I think has come to encompass a lot of people who are post-autonomist or post-council communist, like myself. A lot of us fit in within that loose coalition of communizers, which also include people who I've met who call themselves egoist communists, who have mixed, Stirner and various Marxoid thinkers.
Do you think when it's okay when they're kind of, as you say, in practice, it comes to a time when put some sort of policy forward, do you think there would be then arguments, the anarchos and the communists, then it wouldn't be so harmonious, or this sort of coming together where you don't see that much difference?
The state of disorganization and atomization that we're all facing in late capitalism, there's a broad agreement from the anarchists to the Leninists that we need some kind of third or tertiary organization that is outside of liberal capitalist politics. They all agree on that, right? But now how that organization is going to handle its bylaws, how that organization is going to organize the proletariat, there are disagreements, doctrinal disagreements right there for sure. But they all agree that there needs to be a committee of workers in every locality that is running things. They all agree about that, and their ideas are not contradicting.
You've heard of the Black Bloc I think they have it in France, so they have that in America as well, Black Bloc.
I mean, the Black Bloc is not a group. It's not a form of anarchism. It's a tactic. It's a tactic used by people of a wide range of political aspirations. It's a tactic for anonymity. I think that this has been described heavily in anthropology. If you read David Graeber, who was a professor over in your country, he wrote a book called Direct Action Ethnography, and it's about his own ethnography, about engaging in that form of direct action. And I think that there are quite a few arguments that go back and forth among the left about whether property destruction is useful for revolution. And I think that you can see arguments for and against it. I wouldn't pick a side about that myself. But I think that, as a person as in academia, I'm not going to be the person who's going to scold a working class person who is breaking something which that word. The
point of a revolution or of some sort of a movement is to bring people in with it, isn't it? It's not to sort of alienate them.
If you read David Graeber,
they're using that in media to
Black Blocs. I'm sorry.
Sorry, go on. Sorry.
David Graeber writes that Black Blocs create community. If you read David Graeber's work in Direct Action Ethnography, he's a major anarchist anthropologist who's written about this tactic. It isn't a form of anarchism. It isn't a political ideology. It's a tactic that people from a wide range of views use that tactic. And I think that it can be. Property destruction can bring people together in some instances. Burning a flag in the United States brings people together. I burned a flag on the 4th of July. That's considered property by the state, and it helped me make community with other people on the south side of Chicago. So I think destroying property. You can read Bataille, and Bataille talks about sacrifice. How the sacrifice of expenditure, it creates a sense of community. I think absolutely, property is this thing which we have all these stigmas around. And when we free ourselves to see it be sacrificed, we no longer have all those hangups and attachments anymore. It can be a very liberating thing that brings people together.
When you say,
I think that as philosophers, there's no single stance to take. But I think that we have to admit the arguments for and against all these tactics taken by everyday people on the street.
When you say it's a tactic, that makes real sense, actually.
One of the things that you do facing autonomy is that you do explore a lot of these different movements and think about those sort of tactics without sort of necessarily rejecting them, I suppose. There's something about your process that does involve sort of just thinking through these different types of tactics.
And I think the Johnson Forrest tendency called us to do is to see the workers as workers. What are the workers doing? How are they, responding to things, seeing just how they're behaving, as opposed to thrusting all of our academic analyses upon this outcome causality based approach, how it's going to play out in political capital or something like that. Instead, you have to look at what the workers are doing. I think it would be an exercise in a hermeneutics of suspicion to assume that it is only the rich who are engaging in these Black Bloc tactics. There are people who are working class who act quite irrationally. They act destructively sometimes. And it isn't the task of the scholar to tell them that they're a dupe or tell them that they're just a piece of a system. No, there's real reasons why they're behaving the way they do. Any worker, whether that worker is a far-right Trump supporter or whether that worker is a left-wing militant who's having a wildcat strike, there's real reasons why they're doing the thing that they're doing, and it's not all just some nefarious outside conspiracy that's creating what they're doing or something like that.
If you're a worker and you've got some blokes coming along and they smash up your car, you're not going to join their movement.
I mean, on the other hand, if you look at the protests, I lived in Chicago for a while, and you notice that during the Black Lives Matter protests, sometimes the response of the Black protesters were to find the wealthiest parts of the city and to take over there. And I don't think that it's the rage is against the workers. The rage is often against the city, which have excluded certain types of people. And they're smashing the windows of stores that they feel excluded from, often. I don't think that the examples in history point to that they're going to the poorest neighborhood to smash things up. I think often they're targeting the people who they feel are their oppressors. David Graeber's writing suggests either is they're doing it to everyday people.
Do you then view autonomism as a tactic or an approach?
Yes, I think that autonomism is definitely a tactic. It is definitely a tactical approach. Yes, I absolutely think that's what it led in, and I think that autonomism is more about tactics than it is about ideology, actually.
In terms of tactics, just like one thing that stuck out to me, Zara, is that you described your project as like public intellectualism, but I quite like the fact that you have someone involved that doesn't have a higher education, because the main problem that I see with a lot of I guess far right and even like capitalist actors, they tend to appeal to this kind of like anti-intellectualism that I guess we've kind of seen in like every fascist movement of the past, essentially. I think sometimes I do align myself more with anarcho-communists and far leftism, but then I think sometimes the problem is that it's kind of harder to translate these ideas onto the general public when they can be quite like big and complicated to explain, whereas something like this downward social mobility that you're in fear of, it's all because of immigrants, and if we get them out, then that's like the simple solution. Do you know what I mean? So I think it's good that the left probably employs more tactics in a sense to kind of appeal to the general public and explain things in a more simple and easy to understand way.
Public intellectualism as a tactic, absolutely. I think the left has had, I think journalism, I want to bring up journalism again because that was a question that Bradley started out with, and that was a known tactic that Trotskyists used on the left for however many years. There's a stereotype about the Trotskyist, newspaper salesperson. And I think that was a form of public intellectualism at that point. I think there was a time in history where journalists were often more public intellectuals. But I don't think that that's the case anymore today. And so I think that you see a lot of public intellectuals on the left to engage on social media because they recognize that that's where a lot of disgruntled workers are going to express their frustrations and outrage. I do think that public intellectualism has always been a tactic for Marxists and anarchists. It's always been a tactic for those kinds of groups of people because Marxism and anarchism are, by nature, they require academia to exist to some degree. They require philosophy as an institution in some form to exist. They're also academia mixed with like a very extra academic set of feelings, set of affect, almost. I feel like that's what Marxism and anarchism are. They're, the non-academic bringing a charge or resonance to the areas of things like philosophy and anthropology and economics. The proletarian has gotten his way with those disciplines and has forever altered them. And now those disciplines exist in a way outside the academy in a way which is much less gate-kept. And so one thing I've recognized is that the only place where you see discussions of philosophy going on in the general public is among leftist fringe groups in the United States. I think it's possible that the United States is more anti-intellectual than the UK. So I think that, the only places where you'll get philosophy and economics and anthropology discussed is by left-wing people. And in the United States, due to a half century of McCarthyism, most Marxists and anarchists in the United States, I would say, are not in academia. I would say there's a small percentage of them which are, but I would say most Marxist and anarchist groups I run into are these groups outside of academia, full of people who wouldn't be approved of by academia. And so they end up being one of the only places where intellectualism for the public humanities are allowed to thrive in those locations, because the fascists aren't going to let it thrive and the liberals are going to keep it lowbrow on television. So the left is the only place where you get public intellectualism thriving.
It's quite upsetting, to be honest. A lot of these organizations, like, you know, in the UK, we have Britain First and people like that. And they run like soup kitchens for the homeless, essentially, because they want to sort of get these people that are in quite a vulnerable state, are in fear of downward social mobility, and then be able to translate sort of these fascist ideas onto them. Whereas really, you know, I think that that's a place that definitely like leftists and Marxists, etc., could really step in and say, like, look, the reason that you're suffering in this way is not because of a bunch of immigrants, it's because of the elites, etc. These are the true people that can explain your suffering, I guess, in a way. I guess another question in terms of like the topic of anarchism specifically, how do you think people, we have like these big projects on a state level, right? So like medical research, technological advancements and stuff. How do you think we could make up for that in, I guess, a sort of more anarchist system or communist council system, or how you referred to it? I can't quite remember.
Council communism. Yes, I mean, I think we'll talk more about this as the discussion progresses, but in the States, we're quite used to neglect as the norm, you know, as far as the social welfare system. So in the States, we have a series of organizations which do this stuff called mutual aid, you know, which is a concept which is taken rather directly from Peter Kropotkin, one of the founders of anarchist thought, right? So mutual aid is already one way that those needs are dealt with by anarchists when the state won't do it, which is the norm in some parts of the globe, such as where I'm from. Beside that, I think that trade unions already, especially trade unions like the one I'm part of the Industrial Workers of the World, the IWW, they have something called the Solidarity Fund, where they raise money for people who are part of their organization. I think that unions and councils would naturally have the equivalent of GoFundMes, this crowdfunded account for someone who needs it, and those can exist within locally based council or union organizations, especially those with leftist or socialistic influence. And the IWW is one of such that exists both in your country and the one that I am located in.
The intellectualism, so because I'm thinking, like, if, for example, is the Bernie Sanders campaign in America, was that more intellectual than the Donald Trump one? Really,
that wasn't left wing. That was a liberal.
No.
That was a liberal group. So I don't count them. I don't count them as left wing. I know it's controversial to say that. I know it's very controversial.
Yeah.
But I feel that Bernie Sanders was advocating for welfare capitalism. I think that if you asked him what he wanted, he said it was capitalism. I think that to have a left wing figure, you would have to have someone who wants something besides capitalism. The moment every politician in the United States who has any political office is advocating for capitalism, except for maybe one city council member in Oregon or something like that named Kshama Sawant, maybe. The Trotskyists say that she's communist. But I think that 99% of people who have a high political office in this country cannot be actually socialist. They can play with language of socialism, but they end up being welfare capitalists.
In Facing Autonomy, in Facing Reality book, it deals quite a lot with like workers' publications. And also with autonomism, in Italy, you get like pirate radio stations. So there is this kind of tradition, which again is sort of like of workers producing kind of media of some kind.
With the Bernie thing, for example, I think that, do you kind of find that there might be a danger that you run into some sort of functionalism about what capitalism might mean? Because on the one hand, I agree with you that Bernie Sanders advocates for the free market in the same way. There's some mild changes to how he wants to structure tax. But then he wants to create a welfare system which supports every single American. And you can say that it's welfare capitalism, but then also there's something within that is a little bit anti-free market in that everybody has something at a point of use. So to reject Bernie outright as not left-wing, I see where you're coming from, because in a lot of ways he's not. In other ways, it's kind of like a compromising tactic, right, to vote for Bernie, because you're still getting more support, more distribution of wealth. So do you not think that in some way that in itself is anti-capitalist?
Partly from my background, where I went through a phase of following Bordiga, and the left communists, just like my pal Giles Dov. I'll write Giles Dov's name in the chat.
Yeah, cool.
I don't think that Bernie is to the left of Adam Smith. I think that Adam Smith is a reliable person as far as knowing what capitalism is. And I think that Adam Smith said for capitalism to function, it has to have a welfare system. I think that even for people like Elon Musk, it would be more convenient, even for some corporate heads, if workers were better taken care of by the state. And so I don't feel that it is anti-capitalist to make the capitalist nation state function better. I really don't think it is. I don't think that the Great Britain or Canada are anti-capitalist because they have healthcare systems. I think that your country is still capitalist. I'm sorry.
I wanted to ask a little bit about C.L.R. James. So he sort of starts off as a sort of Trotskyist, but later sort of seems to reject that in favor of some form of sort of emphasis on the sort of workers' self-organization. One of the things I really like about sort of C.L.R. James's work, he sort of explores a sort of range of topics, or uses a sort of range of topics to sort of explore a range of topics, a range of issues. So the Haitian Revolution, cricket, Moby Dick, Russian Revolution, Athenian democracy. Yeah, that's just something that I really like about his work. So how do you understand C.L.R. James's thought, and what's most influential for your own work?
I feel that there are two periods of C.L.R. James' work which are the most important. One of those is kind of, say, early C.L.R. James, where he's writing about Haiti. Whenever he's dealing with Haiti, where he's from, he's getting to areas of thought which you don't get a lot of leftists writing about. A lot of Marxists are not writing about Haiti. The Black Jacobins was a book that was completely, I feel like, a Black autonomist book. I really do think it had that element. It was also a council communist book, of kind of a Black council communist or a Caribbean council communist play, if you will. And I think that his works, when he was part of the Johnson Forest tendency, or what some people call Marxist humanists, somewhat erroneously, a lot of his work in that was very good. And I really like his work at the end of his life. But he has a bunch of work in the middle of his life where he's kind of a Trotskyist. Some of that took place in your country of Great Britain. A bunch of that work I'm not quite fond of. I don't know anything about cricket. I can just give you that. I know nothing about cricket. I don't like team sports myself. So that isn't my area of specialty. So I can't tell you anything about what he thinks about cricket. I can tell you that I am a literature scholar, and I love C.L.R. James's take on modern American literature. I love his take on Moby Dick. I am citing that in my dissertation. I think it's wonderful. I think that because he's written so much, when I try to talk to C.L.R. James scholars in the United States, they're quick to make it as if he doesn't have any particular position on anything, which I think is mistaken. Because I think that for the broad majority of his life, C.L.R. James was far to the left of most Trotskyists, and he had some really unique ideas about dialectics, about global revolution, about Black workers, racialized workers, I should say, about colonized workers, and about local decentralized operation of communities, such as what you see in Every Cook Can Govern, which is an essential text for my reading of James. But again, as you've already mentioned, I love Facing Reality. Facing Reality was a book that he was writing with Cornelius Castoriadis. Cornelius Castoriadis was another kind of Trotskyist that departed from Trotskyism and became council communist. Some people say that Cornelius Castoriadis is an anarchist. I think that could be debated, of course. Regardless, Castoriadis was very influential on the Hungarian Revolution of 1956.
What is his take on Moby Dick?
My understanding of his take on Moby Dick was that he cast aside the naturalist readings that you get in modernism that are focusing on the man versus nature kind of battle between the whale hunter and the whale. He instead puts it in more of what, there's one other literary scholar listening, so I can say this, he puts it in a more cultural materialist explanation where he understands the Moby Dick narrative as a product of the economic world of modern American port towns, whale fishing towns, and so I feel that he places it in a much more cultural materialist point of view, which is kind of similar to what scholars do in official academia much later. If you read Sinfield and Dollamore's work on Shakespeare, they do the same kind of cultural materialist approach, but that's much later, and they were established academics. Meanwhile, C.L.R. James was writing without any letters behind his name. C.L.R. James is an organic intellectual, which is that's another tie back to a thing that we think is important in the Facing Autonomy Collective, which is organic intellectualism.
I mean, also, I think there's something interesting about the context in which, if I'm right, the context in which this book on Moby Dick is actually written. So it's whilst on Ellis Island. There's a parallel between being on Ellis Island and being on the ship. Is that correct?
I definitely think that he grounds the Moby Dick story in a sense of Americanism, in a sense of Americanist mercantilism, as far as locating it as a product of the empire at that turn of the century moment. I don't think that reading is quite so far from, say, Gramsci's work on Americanist economy. If you ever read Gramsci writing about Americanism and Fordism, I just thought of that because someone brought up Gramsci earlier. I think that Gramsci's ideas about Americanism and C.L.R. James's ideas about Moby Dick line up in some interesting ways.
Because I've always thought of a song by the Pogues called Greenland Whale Fisheries when I think of Moby Dick, and that seemed very similar, actually. It's just about chasing this whale and everyone's having a shit time and it's just like a product of that. It's a really brilliant song.
Moby Dick's quite like an encyclopedia of whales.
But they were a big part of the economy at that point in history as well, right? So they were useful they were getting oil out of them, they were doing all kinds of things. I come from the part of the US which had some stake in that, the East Coast. And so
Yeah.
it's not my favorite book. I like C.L.R. James's take on it, but my dissertation is on beat literature. So I think that shows you I am more avant-garde to bring up the goal of this podcast that Bradley runs. I'm more avant-garde than that in my literary case.
It was interesting when you were saying about that cultural materialism, putting something in a context. It seemed to harken back to our conversation almost about kind of tactics, and almost, I guess we were almost talking about positionality. There's a tactic in that kind of reading that is also akin to what you want to do. It is what you want to do when I guess to tie together all of what we talk about, but if you're discussing with workers, you want them to understand their own context within the structures that they're in. I mean, I think of it, this whole conversation had me thinking about, because so I'm currently doing an internship at a small publishing press, and I think the publishing industry is ripe for, I would love to see, there are some gorgeous radical presses, small presses in Britain and in the US that I absolutely love, who are doing some really, particularly also in literally kind of worker-owned, they are rather they are either cooperative or more autonomous models of work, but also generally as a whole, as a global billions of dollar industry, there is so much potential for organization, particularly now in the days where everything's kind of remote and it's all work that can be done remotely. You're getting people who are either reading or writing essentially for a living, who are, have a certain level of education and understanding. It's a skilled level of work where you're asking people to understand like large amounts of text. So you'd think that you could understand principles in certain ways, people being able to see their own context.
The authors of the book Facing Reality write, "It is not the business of the Marxist organization to invent what Marx scornfully called recipes for the cookshops of the future. It is sufficient to watch carefully what the workers are actually doing and what they are aiming at, and draw the conclusions." So how did these sort of ideas shape the development of the Johnson-Fordist tendency, and how did they come to influence what we think of as autonomism?
So I have the best answer on the second part of that question, which is I've done some looking into the ways in which we might have gotten the influence of the Johnson-Forest tendency upon the Italian autonomists. I'm friends with a scholar of autonomism who has gone and done some work over in Italy named Arlen Austin, who he has gone to Italy and done some research in the library of some of the folks out there, Silvia Federici's library, the library of other autonomous feminists out there. Arlen has conveyed to me that a fellow named Ferruccio Gambino, of the Italian Autonomist, was very instrumental in translating a lot of American Black radical thought and bringing it to Italy. So some of Ferruccio Gambino's work is on the libcom.org website. If you ever go on libcom, he has a wonderful text on Malcolm X, which is again, I think that it speaks to this issue of distance, because Gambino was a person in Italy, and he was writing about an American revolutionary. And so he had a very different approach to it than I think that you would get from American Marxists or American Trotskyists in this country, who might not have recognized Malcolm X as independent from someone like Martin Luther King. I think from someone further out, it was easier to see these individuals in separate contexts from one another instead of grouping them all. Whereas people who are close to these figures, what might have grouped them. Sergio Bologna, or I'm not sure how you pronounce his name because I don't speak Italian, but I believe his name is Sergio Bologna. Sergio Bologna has written an excellent piece of work bringing the American IWW, or Industrial Workers of the World, an organization I'm part of. He brought that and them into conversation with some council communists. And so those are two examples of Italian autonomists who were able to translate and bring pieces of the American revolutionary experience into the Italian moment of the autonomous 1970s. As far as the Johnson-Forest tendency, it's clear that they were a group of people who were broadly construed in several kind of Marxist camps, who were kind of moving further left than those Marxist camps, moving into a kind of a criticism of party Marxism and a criticism of the heavily regimented forms of Trotskyism that were available at the time, and they were coming into association with some left communists and some anarchists. And I think that the relevance of the Johnson-Forest tendency is very clear in the US right now, because in a lot of senses, the Trotskyist organizations in this country, one of the major ones was called the International Socialist Organization, or the ISO. They've collapsed due to sexual assault controversies within them. And so I think that a lot of former Trotskyists in the US today are looking more into things like the Democratic Socialists of America. They're looking into anarchist organizations, and then they're also becoming more influenced by left communist ideas. And I think that this happens with Trotskyists a certain amount, is that their organizations go kerplooey. Their tactical advice was always to join other organizations anyway, so their members have no problem joining other kind of organizations, becoming involved in these other sets of politics. And so I think the Johnson Forest tendency was kind of a product of that kind of cycle of Trotskyist organizational inhale, exhale sort of, where, the Johnson Forest tendency was a bunch of Trotskyists who had followed the Trotskyist doctrine of entryism and had subsequently left Trotskyism and had become something quite different, something quite far to the left of what kind of Trotskyist opportunities were available in their time.
Maurizio Lazaretto writes that the great transformation that began at the start of the 1970s has changed the very terms in which the question is posed. Manual labour is increasingly coming to involve procedures that could be defined as intellectual, and the very communications technologies increasingly require subjectivities that are rich in knowledge. So how has the nature of the worker changed over the last 50 years? And to what extent can theorists such as Lazaretto, Negri, Verno, and Tronti help us think through some of these changes?
What's very interesting, and I think that it's relevant to bring this up, is that the autonomists have been horribly co-opted and recuperated by the humanities. And a lot of them have gotten less radical. And so I think a lot of people who study English today at the graduate level, like myself, a lot of us, we bumped into the work of Antonio Negri. Antonio Negri was at the forefront of the autonomous movement in the 1970s, and now he has some kind of cushy academic job at some Ivy League place in the US. I think that the Tony Negri that people see today and the Tony Negri that was existent in Italy in the 1970s, those are two different Tony Negris. The one Tony Negri that was willing to openly say smash the state or say things along those lines in the 1970s, but today I think that he's departed into post-structural euphemisms more broadly. My advisor, who is not a Marxist, my advisor flirts with leftist thought, but my advisor's name is Robert McGruer. I had read his book. His book is a book in queer disability studies. That will refer to your other question that you wanted to ask about the trans episode. We'll get to that soon. My advisor studies queer disability studies. He's a book called Crip Theory about queer disability politics, and he did a book about Great Britain recently called Crip Times. His work tends to be a kind of mix of liberal, queer, and disability politics and post-structuralism. He'll mix a bunch of other things with that. One of his first book, Theory, it lured me to Negri's writings. And I found all this stuff about Multitude and the Empire series, and I wasn't happy with it. But then I found out about Negri's days involved in Praxis, where he was actually organizing other workers in Italy, and his work and his behaviors in that time were much, much different than the Tony Negri that teaches at Princeton today or wherever he teaches. His work in the 1970s, he was really trying to answer these questions of what effective labor is, how is labor changing at the beginning of neoliberalism. He was trying to answer those questions from an honest, organizing-based position. And I think that today, Tony Negri's work has far departed the question of what to do, and his work is more about how do we analyze the entire global once. That's, of course, it's laudable to attempt it, but I think that Negri has lost the plot these days as far as how to act in the locality. If you read his work, Effective Labor, about domination and subsumption from the 1970s, he was very clear on the ways in which you should act in the short term in those days. But today he has become really alienated from practice, from action. What was really useful about his work in the 1970s and also Lazaretto's was that they were aware that all of the current day institutions of leftism and of identity and of nationalism had become corrupted by mechanistic capitalist alienation of various kinds. That the unions had become liberal and the parties had become servants of the liberal capitalist nationalist state. And so all of these institutions are not working for the workers. All these old tactics which were embodied in these institutions were not functioning either. And there was instead interest in understanding how have workers lost so much power? How have workers lost their autonomy? How have workers lost their power? That was where their discussion of labor began, which was why do workers have so little power within unions, within political parties, within workplaces? No group of people have asked that question so honestly as the Italian autonomists asked that question in the 1970s. And they were really open-minded about it. And I think that's what made them really easy to gobble up by liberals, because the liberals just turned them into an accessory to liberalism, and I think that you do get, Fred Ricci was on my podcast, and she's a shell of her former self. She used to be a radical voice on the edge of the mainstream, really willing to call out the gaps in Marxist feminism. Today, she's not as grounded at practice. This also begins to answer your question about wages for housework, which was in your...
Both in Negri and the person that was on your program, how do they defend their shift in view and their shift away from praxis?
I don't think that they even acknowledge it. Is the thing. If you ask them if they have, they would tell you that they have not shifted whatsoever. For a young scholar like myself to talk to these tenured European professors and to tell them that they've lost the plot it doesn't work out too well.
So in her 1975 Wages Against Housework, Silvia Federici rejects wages for housework as an end in itself, but also argues that it offers the only revolutionary perspective in the way that it politicizes domestic labour as labour. So she writes, in this sense, wages for housework will be much more than educational than trying to prove that we can work as well as them, that we can do the same jobs. We will leave this worthwhile effort to the career woman, the woman who escapes from her oppression, not through the power of unity and struggle, but through the power of the master, the power to oppress, usually other women. And we don't have to prove that we can break the blue-collar barrier. A lot of us broke this barrier a long time ago and have discovered that the overalls did not give us any more power than the apron, if possible, even less, because now we had to wear both and had less time and energy to struggle against them. How we should think about this perspective in relation to gender liberation today.
I find that Federici's work in Wages for Housework, as much as it claims to be a forward motion in the history of anarchist feminism or more Marxist feminism, it instead hints at a turn back to a disregarded chapter in the history of anarchist feminism. The chapter one might title Feminist Syndicalism. Millie Whitcomb Rocker was one of the first people to write about feminist syndicalism, and she was a partner of the notorious anarchist feminist writer. His name was Rudolf Rocker, who is one of the key writers, if you want to read about someone who is trying to mix anarchism and unionism. Rudolf Rocker is one of the clearest voices on that. I see Silvia Federici, Wages for Housework is it's a return to what if women were unionized? Oh wait, but we can't really do that in this political order. So we're going to create, what that project has unfortunately resulted in is a series of nonprofits that use that concept within the nonprofit vein. So I think it's one of those things where the idea behind Wages for Housework is more radical than the practice that it wound up inspiring. You know, was never grounded in the anarchist feminist practice of building labor unions for domestic laborers. It never resulted in campaigns within the institution that is the familial unit to unseat the power of masculinized people to control the family unit. And so I think there's a bit of, this is a book where I feel that Federici starts to get, as I mentioned earlier, she starts to sidle away from a practice-based politics of tactics around certain autonomist style tactics. And she starts to get into the autonomist theory of labor, if you will, which I think that there is one. And it's much better than many other Marxist anarchist theories of labor, but it's very easy to just turn it into a theory and to remove it from the practical circumstance of autonomous revolt, which was quite real in the 1970s and had several tactical lessons.
I think that I've been reading this book actually called 23 Things They Don't Tell You About Capitalism. And I mean, it's kind of good, but I mean, he's basically just advocating for like softcore capitalism anyway. In the book, he's saying, so essentially like the washing machine made like a huge difference in a lot of women's lives because it meant that they didn't need to spend as much time at home and that they could go out and get a career at stuff. My question is, do you think that this kind of concept or policy of wages for housework might not be so applicable today as it was back when these things started being developed? How can, I guess, Marxist feminism catch up with this new era of washing machines, I guess?
A feminist unionist movement is urgently needed today. I have at points tried to start trade unionist organization for trans women before myself. I am a trans woman myself. I have not been successful in that regard. My organization, the Industrial Workers of the World, the IWW, we've tried to start caucuses within that organization for queer workers or for feminine workers before, and there has been some success with that question. I feel that some sort of organization of labor on that basis is needed. The washing machine is certainly a step up from what we had at one point, but I think that some of these autonomous feminists have been criticized for their transphobia since their time in the limelight in the 1970s. And so I think that definitely if we were to organize, a union for domestic laborers, it could no longer be a strictly cis women's union anymore. It would have to be for all domestic laborers to work within, and I do think the idea still has promise, and I think that we need more unionization, not less. But I'm afraid that if it is put in an organization or a non-government organization, it will just become another snappy mission statement, which will be used to levy charity dollars instead of actually a tactic for working women to organize among themselves, or working feminine people or working domestic laborers to organize among themselves.
So you're kind of saying that what the text gets right is the way that there's something important about unionizing domestic work, but it tends to be led to in a way to something like a non-profit organization, which is something that we're very critical of.
Yes, absolutely. I think that it's been applied in a form which is far different from how someone like Millie Whitcomb-Rocker would apply it in Germany, whereas there were women's unions in the 1900s. That goal of starting unions for women has been abandoned by so many people, including some of the autonomists.
What is autonomous?
I treat it as principally a school of Marxist and anarchist thought that appeared in the Italian 1970s. But I think that it has the child of a concept of post-autonomism, which is people that have taken bits of the original autonomous set of ideas and have merged them with other ideas for one reason or another. And I think that you see a lot of post-autonomist kind of people in both left liberal circles like Bernie supporters, or you'll also see some post-autonomous people in further left circles like where I reside politically.
Is it something to do with the autonomy of the working class not necessarily being organised through unions or through the party, as it was? It's the autonomy of the working class or something like that?
For the most further left interpretations of autonomism are about the autonomy of the working class. There is a tendency to interpret autonomism as in a way which is quite different than that. I think that as a material movement in real life, it was a group of people in the 1970s in Italy. As far as a concept in Marxism or anarchism, autonomy is about the autonomy of the working class. I think autonomy as a concept and autonomism are separate things. Autonomism was a group of people in a time and place, but autonomy, it's a wider horizon for how to imagine society being run. It's a wider horizon for how you interpret Marxism and anarchism around autonomy.
George Katsifiakis, is that him? Quote, in contrast to the centralized decisions and hierarchical authority structures of modern institutions, autonomous social movements involve people directly in decisions affecting their everyday lives, seeking to expand democracy.
That's one of the more broad interpretations of what autonomism means, yes.
How would you define the less broad definition?
Political and social interpretations of Marxism and anarchism that favor the autonomy of the working class as a necessary goal within all institutions, organizations, and political or social fields.
The podcast I thought was really interesting was your one on trans-feminist Marxism and anarchism in the age of xenofeminism, how you think about trans-feminist Marxism and anarchism, and how these differ from more dominant liberal model of trans inclusion.
I mean, again, I would go back to tactics and practice. For one, since that's a topic we were discussing earlier, the practices and tactics of a Marxist or anarchist trans-feminist, that they would like trans-feminine inclusion and affirmation within non-liberal and capitalist institutions, and that those people are not looking for inclusion in, say, the US military, that they're looking for the autonomy of trans people in some form or another, trans workers in some form or another. I see one organization that I think that attempts to enact a kind of trans-feminine feminist anarchism or Marxism might be a group called the Radical Fairies, which has been a group that has had LGBT pagan communes around the United States and several in Europe since the 1970s, the Radical Fairies, for LGBT people to put their energy and time into organizations that don't seek integration within the state, but instead seek a life outside of the liberal order, outside of an assimilation within the liberal order, who instead are anti-assimilationists and wish to have their principles expressed instead of kind of making a short-term trade-off for greater levels of comfort in exchange for a more questionable lack of community principles in the long term. I think that, earlier it was brought up this phenomenon of Western countries using LGBT rights issues to justify war. There are well-known scholars and activists in the United States who call that kind of move, they call it pink washing. And that is exactly the kind of anarchist transfeminists and Marxist transfeminists are trying to avoid pink washing. Pink washing is the word for when nation states try and use LGBT rights to justify their colonialist wars.
This is really interesting because this is like literally what I've been writing about. And I've just read about, theories of like homonormativity and things like homo-nationalism. I don't know, could you just like talk more about that? I guess it would help me with my essay a little bit.
I think that there's been a lot of LGBT folks who have grown up with LGBT rights on the table, especially in Western countries like myself, who have increasingly recognized that the liberal order is not favoring increases in quality of life for LGBT people, and it's also using LGBT people to justify colonialism, as you say. And I think that many LGBT folks have moved further left toward anarchism. And I've observed that among people in the academic area of study known as queer theory. One of my favorite queer theorists when I was in undergrad was a person named Jack Halberstam today. And Jack Halberstam, throughout my academic career, has moved closer and closer to anarchism, such that Jack Halberstam's most recent book, he's a transgender man and a queer theorist that's very prominent in the US humanities community. His most recent book is going to be about anarchism. And his most recent conference presentation of the last couple of years was about the French anarchist group called the Invisible Committee. Jack Halberstam is one of several trans anarchists that have some prominence in the United States in academia. And there's a couple of others. Another one I can think of is Dean Spade. Another one I can think of is Shay Gossett. There are several transgender anarchist intellectuals around the country, only a couple of which have a role in academia, most of which are just everyday people who work at Taco Bell, such as several trans women I talked to who live in Colorado. But increasingly, LGBT people have a lack of hope or faith in the liberal order to represent their interests. And so they hope that the liberal capitalist order falls apart and leads to greater autonomy for LGBT people.
Like how I completely agree with you as a queer woman who's also been become further and further left and done that to a certain extent. I definitely think queerness has had an inflection on that. I was watching the creator of Philosophy Tube, Abigail Thorne, came out recently and is now thrust herself into the spine. The virtue of coming out has now become a huge, one of the most well-known trans women in Britain. And I recently saw a interesting conversation with her, and then she was talking about how horrifically transphobic our country is, and particularly in levels of journalism and the political. And there is just no, even in a way, I think turfism in Britain is way more, I would say it's more entrenched than in the US. There isn't really even a left platform for. But one thing I was thinking about in response to what you were saying is but what happens when, how are we supposed to cope when, say, things, essential services like healthcare are things that we rely on partly from the state. If we're thinking about things like access to healthcare, but not just that, I was thinking other things too. Could you foresee in which we do still rely on this liberal bureaucracy? And because queer people, particularly trans people, are systematically, that's why there's certain movements which are saying, okay, we want to fit within your system because then at least we can get access to things. But then there's also a way in which we don't want to be part of your system at all because your system is shit. How do you approach that kind of dilemma? I'd be interested to know.
The LGBT history of the United States is one where we're quite aware that, the government was very slow in dealing with the AIDS epidemic. I wish I could rely on the state to offer me decent healthcare. I really can't. The trans healthcare that exists in the United States today, it tends to be through nonprofits that are functioning as healthcare providers. I don't think the state is doing very much to take care of trans people as much as we would like to think that it is. It's overwhelmingly not. It's kind of enterprising kind of movements that have been the result of our people organizing, of trans people organizing for years and gay people organizing for years, that have made the state at all give us the healthcare that we need. And I think that maybe LGBT organizing has been more successful in the United States for certain reasons than in Great Britain, potentially. I'm not sure if the difference is, but I know that the ACT UP was very successful in the United States as far as getting corporations and the state to start treating AIDS occasionally. I think it's very easy for LGBT folks in this country to see that the corporations and the state never really cared for us. And when they have cared for us, it was because of our own movements, of our own effort that made them care for us. Giving them our obedience does more harm in the long run than constantly asking them to justify themselves. I'm a little curious about how I don't know about the AIDS history in Great Britain. I only know AIDS history in the United States. It wasn't treated very well, and a lot of gay people had to die.
It wasn't. I know less of it. My partner's a historian who she covers that area. Not actually. She looks at black activism in that era. Most of what I know is slightly secondhand from her. But there were movements. There had to be movements in order to recognise that there were. ACT UP was also had an element here. There were movements to get the drugs available that people needed on the NHS. But that was a strategic movement that had to happen. Don't know, someone else might know, but I think Thatcher notoriously did she never mention AIDS, I think, or mention it once, or it's that kind of thing. It was a similar kind of horrific climate, wasn't it?
It was quite homophobic and transphobic, but I assume by extension.
Also we had Section 28 at the time.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
That was just totally
So
insane. And I remember
definitely.
I read this book recently, and I've never really had a thing for like the royals, but then it said that Princess Diana opened up the first HIV/AIDS treatment ward in like the 80s or something, when, the press just ripped her to shreds and basically said that, she's shaking hands with all of these perverts that are spreading like this disease around and stuff. And that was like really inspiring for me to read, especially.
Like that cemented her as like the sweetheart of like so many people, but also changed this huge, that like was quite a turning point in the discourse about AIDS in Britain.
There's a documentary, Sarah Schulman, and I think Sarah Schulman's the producer on it. I can't remember who's the director. United in Anger. There's a really interesting line in there. We wanted the slogan to be healthcare as a human right, because even though we were talking often about gay people and obviously queer people more generally, they saw that this could actually be something that spoke to a whole range of people, because healthcare as a human right is a huge issue that affects loads of people for loads of different reasons. But obviously it was a big issue in relation to the AIDS epidemic.
There are probably possibilities now, just how soon society starts to get back to, well, not normal, but I think we've all been in situations where we've seen the result of chronic underfunding. We've seen the result of what neoliberalism has done to our healthcare system, particularly in like Europe and particularly Western Europe, where they're very good at thinking that they're living the liberal dream in some ways. And it's like, no, you haven't. And you're selling off these things. You're completely remodeling how you're thinking that like care should be working. I mean, particularly like, it's not any, but particularly I would say, there are some of the most pressing things are definitely the state of trans healthcare in Britain.
So I suppose one of the things I kind of worry is the way that capitalism sort of manages its inclusion, where it has these kind of very symbolic kind of inclusions, or I kind of tempted to adapt Marcuse and call it kind of repressive inclusion, that sort of element, especially within neoliberalism, which seems it's really on a symbolic level. It doesn't talk about healthcare. There's been a lot of pushes, in some respects not inherently bad, like probably Princess Diana, a case of this, and it's probably had some positive, like it has pushed representational issues forward, but that's where things stop. And I also think potentially neoliberal progressive versions of representational issues might be different if you're a liberal than if you're a socialist, even though they are simply representational issues. That there will be a different driving idea behind them, I guess.
Right. Well, I think that they absolutely are. The difference between a more assimilationist aspect of the trans movement would be someone who would, be very happy that Biden was going to choose a trans woman to be healthcare secretary, right?
Yeah.
And people are holding that as something to celebrate. I can see why there are certain reasons why on a symbolic level that would be very exciting to have a trans woman at such a high level of government, sure. But I think on the other hand, a person like that would lend credence to other things that the Biden administration is doing in a way which would mean a kind of compromise for the trans community, to make the trans community have to feel forced to be cheerleaders for other things that the liberal order is responsible for, such as drone bombings or bombing Syria. I think that that's the trade-off that you get from queer theorists like Jasper K. Puar, who wrote Terrorist Assemblages and critiqued homo-nationalism. That might be someone that our undergraduate friend, is his name Ethan? Maybe Ethan was reading some Puar for the homo-nationalism concept, which is that there's this trade-off. Once you integrate this oppressed group within your regime, that oppressed group, then it gets its own bureaucracy of liberal representatives, which give credence to whatever the government is doing. And I think that does mean that trans people are more, it forces them to be more wedded toward reformist horizons for future political changes. And I think that a socialist or a communist trans person, we wouldn't want to make such a trade, such a compromise, where all of a sudden we're forced to defend a liberal government because it gave us a little smidge of representation. We don't want to make that compromise. And we would rather say, you can keep being a transphobic government. We know you're going to do that regardless of who you have in your government. Just don't even pretend, don't even give us a celebrity face when you're going to keep gatekeeping trans healthcare for only those who can afford it, which is the case. Even if we do get a trans healthcare secretary from the Biden administration, if you're a poor Black trans woman and you're homeless, you won't be able to get your surgeries most likely regardless. You won't be able to get the basic things that you need. Even if you do have a white trans woman in the government, it won't change the fundamentals of how the US governing system works. It'll just tell people who are mistreated that they should be happier with what they've got.
It's kind of like, I guess, like pinkwashing like neoliberalism in a way, right? There's this meme of like the gay anti-homeless bench where like they've basically like painted this this bench in like rainbow colors and then put up these like metal barriers to prevent homeless people from sleeping on it. And it's like, okay, great, like fine, whatever, a bench to make me feel more included. But I would much rather that that homeless person had like a place to stay, or that, you know, young trans people had access to puberty blocker treatment. Even though I'm not a trans person, I would much rather they had that than I had, you know, a bench that's supposed to make me feel more included in my local community. You know what I mean?
In The Gathering Forces, C.L.R. James writes, the most appeal for socialism ever made in the Western Hemisphere turns upon race, upon imperialism, upon the proletariat of all colours. This appeal was made by Stokely Carmichael, whose cry of black power has reverberated from one end of the Americas to the other. So I get the impression that your own engagement with contemporary struggles, such as the struggles that are emerging after the murder of George Floyd, are sort of attempting to deepen and develop concerns of the Johnson-Forrest tendency. How can these struggles, both then and now, help us think about, one, the sort of relationship between race and class, and two, strategies and tactics, which is something that we were talking about earlier. Yeah.
Again, the Johnson-Forrest tendency was arguing that the working class doesn't fit clearly into a Leninist political party or into any of these socialist or liberal union that is banning striking from happening among its union workers. The working class doesn't fit into any of these frames for the Johnson-Forrest tendency. They're called Marxist humanists, but I think that that's dangerous wording these days, because I think that humanism has become associated with the French Enlightenment. I don't think that humanism is a good word for them. I would call them a Marxist personalist, because I was briefly a Quaker, and there's this notion of personalism in Quakerism. I converted to Quakerism in high school. Quakers are all about kind of an informal presence. I really think that if we follow the autonomous line of thought, masculinity and femininity, the construct of whiteness and racialization, these are divisions of labor in a kind of Marxist sense. These are divisions upon laborers. And so I think that a lot of the struggles that you see in these traditional institutions like Marxist political party is that you have workers who have been socialized into a managerial role over the family unit, a masculinized worker who is socialized into a managerial role in the family unit. Their labor training and their labor socialization is coming into conflict with workers who have been socialized into a feminine caring role in the informal family unit. And the two forms of labor that they're taught to give out has come into conflict. And all of the masculinized workers are used to, you know, masculine labor management within the family unit, and so that they're mechanistically caught in the habit of dominating or managing women workers, because that's one aspect of their labor socialization, many of them. I do think that identity is one of those things which shouldn't be as distanced from economic issues, and I think the autonomists saw this very clearly as well. Once we recognize that, there's a point in which we should recognize that racial capitalism, you know, creates a very specific type of labor that it asks for from racialized workers versus those who are not racialized workers, versus those who get to occupy the default of whiteness. We have to combine our analysis of institutional subsumption with an analysis of how each identity category represents a certain type of labor socialization that carries us over to our political organizing work, is that a part of us are still in the mechanical routine of acting like a laborer, even when we're doing political organizing. And so that means that some of us are in the labor socialization of doing managerial labor over other workers, because that has been the socialization that our labor has undergone over our lives. I think that once we recognize that all of the workers in a party or whatever organization they're still carrying out their mechanical socialization into one or another division of labor, that we understand how a Marxist political party or a liberal union is not going to automatically represent its workers the way it should, and the way that these other forms of labor existence are going to get in the way of these leftist projects.
There's something that I've been dwelling on, and I don't really know where I fall within it in terms of my opinion, but I think that there's something very interesting about how the left, which tends to, you can either think of it in terms of left and right, but you can also think of politics in terms of the centre, which is nationalist and conservative and defending yourself. And outside of that, you have a system where you've got all of these disparate groups that are striving for some sort of autonomy for themselves. And the reason why perhaps these smaller groups don't necessarily succeed is because they don't impose structure on the world in which strong nationalist values do, or way the corporations can apply really, really strict economic principles that don't necessarily make sense but can be applied to the world in some way, and you can organize your labor of these corporations in such a powerful way that they make, in which power is then dominating people. Maybe the solution for the left wing is to start establishing its own kind of forms of hierarchy and its own impositions on what the world might look like and the objectives in which unity might achieve those goals.
The question of method is important there, because then I think we're going back to tactics, and then we're going back to autonomism. I think that's what you have to hold true to. You have to have certain principles. I'm definitely like an anarcho-syndicalist. I think that you need structures, but it's like, your life works through, we have structured relations with each other, but they can be better. You have people you work with. I mean, syndicalism is a kind of anglicized way of saying it, in other ways. It is basically is anarcho-unionism, isn't it? But yeah, I mean, I think autonomism, like using, like Zara was saying, it's not without structures. It is just, but the question is doing something different than Soviet Union workers' councils, or maybe it would have been okay without the workers' councils if there wasn't a state,
Yes. Well, this question on authority that Harvey brought up is it's so interesting, because one of the first things, if you ever meet a Marxist-Leninist, a defender of Stalin, on the internet, one of the things that they all will always throw at the anarchists is they'll throw this essay by Friedrich Engels, which is called On Authority, where Engels is defending authority in some form or another. One of the most interesting kind of rebuttals to this argument that you get from the Stalinists about Engels is this argument that I would love to, this one council communist in the 70s, his name is Maximilian Rubel. He was a council communist in the 70s. He wrote an excellent article that's on the internet. You should look it up. It's called Marx as a Theoretician of Anarchism. And Rubel argues that Marx was an anarchist, which I know it's a very controversial point of view, but part of this argument suggests that because Engels was Marx's financial backer, Engels was paying for everything for Marx. He forced Marx into being a kind of social democrat, and that Marx was himself much more kind of anarchistic as a writer than Engels was in this article. I find the argument somewhat persuasive. I find this persuasive. I know that it's a controversial argument, but I think it's a really interesting point that Marx's writings himself tend to be more stateless and less about believing in some political party, whereas Engels' writings independently tend to be more in belief in some political party organization. And Marx's writing, and Bradley points this out earlier in this conversation, he points out Marx's book, The Civil War in Paris. The Civil War in Paris is a book about the French Revolution, and it's a book about the Paris Commune. That's what I meant. It's a book about the Paris Commune, and Marx is very critical of centralization in that book. Yeah. Marx is not defending centralization in the least book in this book. I think that there is a basis to think that Karl Marx was much more of a council communist or an anarchist, whatever have you, an anti-state communist at least. And then Friedrich Engels, who was the rich guy in the duo, Friedrich Engels was paying all of Marx's bills. Friedrich Engels was Marx's boss or benefactor, and that Friedrich Engels was keeping Marx in this very liberal or state party trajectory in his work.
Very interesting take, and I think that it's actually something that you can that was neglected at the early part of the 20th century. There's so many quotes from Marx which can kind of justify, you can see that kind of position, like the bit where he says in the Marxist society there will be no fishermen, there will just be people that fish, right? Even that it's kind of like you're undermining institutions there. That's his ideal utopia, is that there isn't an authority that you go up to. There are just people that do stuff.
I just posted a link in the chat. It's this essay by Maximilian Rubel written in the 70s, and it's an essay where Rubel is making this argument that Engels is more of a liberal, a state liberal, and that Marx was the anarchist all along. I found that quite profound.
Maddie was describing it. I'm still not totally sure what if it's a structure that exists that is good for people, and that structure could sort of diminish as an oppressive structure. It will diminish. I don't see how that's any different to communism.
Oh yeah, I mean, what I was kind of talking about was a kind of anarcho-communism, I guess.
Yeah.
It is. I think autonomism as a movement is where anarchism and Marxism come together. Examples of both, which are much further away, and how well they, it's hard because there's a difference between kind of practice and then the kind of theoretical historical definition.
Tell me the anarchistic part of that. Which is the anarchy part?
The anti-statist and the kind of anti kind of almost aversion to kind of, particularly the state, but having an understanding that the state is also it's a bureaucracy and a kind of a wariness of bureaucracy. But I think that's not useful in and of itself. I would critique any anarchist who would say that in itself, you've got to come up with some other ideas. But I think anarchism as a whole is so much of it, there's actually, the problem with it as a whole is there's a lot less literature in some ways, because a lot of it's very practical and a lot of it is practice based and it's tactical, and it's also organizing. It's about direct action. Even to some, the idea of like even unionism is more, to some anarchists, I think it seems more a slower kind of pace. It's more building things in a way in which anarchism can be quite reactionary. So ironic, which is what Harvey was saying. You've got to have an idea of building something.
I actually think there's a real blur between the two, especially like, Rosa Luxemburg, for example. She's thinking about a lot of those kind of things, or C.L.R. James, or like, and Anne Marx as well. Like, I think they're all kind of trying to think about something that's quite similar to a lot of what anarchists are. Maybe I think it was Derek C. Varn was making this distinction between anarchists tended to want to get rid of the state, then get capitalism, then capitalism wanted to, or something like that, an ordering of which one you get rid of first.
Is that instead of authority, you should have solidarity, is the classic, I would say. Is it other forms of relation to one another? Of particularly, one that which is about support and obligation, and it's not about hierarchy, but it's about kind of radical sympathy.
On the same level as opposed to the higher,
but also not, and based on kind of a certain level of commonality, but not a kind of, say, you can have solidarity as a worker again, it's a solidarity of sometimes of circumstance, sometimes people talk about it in terms of movements like that, but I guess you could almost have a solidarity which is beyond that, which is how do you think of solidarity outside circumstance?
Yeah, it's amazing that you're saying that, because an example of that then is like
I thought it's useful to bring back Engels' notion of authority to the sociologist Weber, Weber's notion of rank and authority and administrative power, and I think the kind of authority that Engels wound up defending was the bureaucratic authority to a large degree in that essay anyway, and I think the kind of authority that anarchists managed to respect, regardless of their critiques of political parties, that anarchists respect epistemological authority or scientific authority. I don't think that Kropotkin was himself a natural scientist. Kropotkin was a geographer, and many anarchists in the history of anarchism have been big respecters of the knowledge of scientists and the knowledge of a specific career areas. And so I do think that believing in working class autonomy means we do believe in the authority of the worker over their area of work, but we're very critical of this notion of the authority of a party, of a party official, or the authority of a paid union organizer over the authority of a rank and file or union organizer. And so to bring back these organizations, bring up the organizations like Solidarity Federation over in Great Britain, the IWW depends upon rank and file organizers to organize its union shops, whereas the liberal unions have these career labor organizers whose job it is to organize the shop. And so I think that that's a really illustrative point as far as the difference between a more liberal or Leninist notion of authority, which is in bureaucratic rank, or a notion of authority which is more based in who is the authority about a given situation. That's the person who lives in it.
Is it that people, or as a species or something, we are quite sort of naturally organized? We're naturally organized, and we'll have a natural little order and organization, and there's no need for these big structures. Anything extra is not really that.
I definitely think the anarchist notion of human nature is, it's very contrary to like Hobbesian Leviathan. The state is needed to state as a kind of bastion of the chaos of thing else. Kropotkin, like Zara said, he had quite a lot of belief in science, and a lot of it was his views of human nature was that people can organize and coexist in certain ways. Really great conversation. I was going to say, Bradley, I love your earrings.
Oh, thank you.
Also, and the matching eyeshadow is it's just you're just looking amazing as
thank
usual.
You.
And it was lovely to speak to you.
Thank you for coming.
Yeah,
thank you. It's good to meet you, Maddie.
Yeah, lovely.
Like, Lord of the Flies, I'd say that's a kind of a right-wing book. Do you know that book?
Well, it's notable in the United States, they don't teach that there was social class among the characters in Lord of the Flies. In the US, they kind of teach it in this way where it's kind of class blind, whereas an astute reader from your country would notice the clear class distinctions between the boys in that novel. And so I think it's notable that Lord of the Flies is it's an extremely class book, and it's about a mob of wealthy people overtaking the most poor among them. But in the American context, that aspect of it is completely left out, just taught as a kind of book about the tyranny of structurelessness, is what they would call it these days. In fact, if they were all like Piggy, if they were all more working class, I think that it might be a picture of cooperation. But because you have these managerial class, middle class boys struggling for authority, it looks more like the House of Parliament in your country than it does, any kind of workers' union where people are cooperating or something.
I
It's
suppose
been a pleasant conversation. I have to have dinner. It's time for me to have dinner over in the States.
Well,
But
thank
you so much for this.
Oh no, thank you. It's been actually really interesting and really brilliant.
Fantastic. Bye.
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 Bye.